Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Right Ruminations. We're here to discuss the place that populism has within the Parthenon. So, I don't know exactly where you're going to begin with populism. Obviously, as a political ideology, populist ideologies are probably the oldest. One of the earliest populists I'm aware of would be the Gracchi brothers in the 2nd century BC in the Roman Republic. Within the United States context, populism is generally considered to have begun in the post-Civil War era in the 1880s and 90s as a coalition between Western farmers and southern states vis-a-vis the Northeast and Midwest. So that's sort of I don't know how you would start with populism. Those are just some ideas of how I look at the sort of historical background. So where do you start in the history of populism, specifically in the United States?
Well, I think that one of the reasons that populism may be the oldest ideology that we've discussed is because in many ways it's an attitude or a stance rather than an ideology. So it's always going to be present as kind of the dynamic of society. In the United States, I would say that populism probably began with the Jacksonians. And I think that's a good case study for populism because populism is always in reaction to something that the elites might have been doing otherwise, but would seem to be failed to be accomplishing. And so there is this kind of paradoxical elitism in populism where they're always looking to some kind of strong man to solve their problems. And so very often when the elites are perceived to not be doing their job, populism, unlike libertarianism, kind of wants to displace those elites with people who are more answerable to the common people. And you really see this with the Jacksonians because the main enemy of the Federalists in the early American Republic were the Republicans, like Jefferson and Madison. And these people were seen to have been in dereliction of their duties to the common people. And so the Jacksonian enterprise was kind of a reaction to the failure of the Republicans. And so it involved a lot of things that we'd associate with populism today, wanting to dismantle the banking system, wanting an expansion of the franchise. And this was all tied up with the very beginning of the Democratic Party. And then you're right that this is later something that, keeping in character with the Jacksonian populists, is revived in the West and to an extent in the South after the Civil War period in the early 20th century. A good example of that would be someone like William Jennings Bryan. And you see a lot of the same themes that go through both of these movements in America also echoed in the kind of populism associated with Donald Trump or Sam Francis. And there seem to be these common strands. One is that they're anti-war, but they're not anti-war to the extent that the libertarians are. They tend to be against specific types of wars that they associate with the elites and the interests of the ruling class, but they're perfectly willing to put their support behind wars that they think are sort of in keeping with the interests of the people. They're against the full expression of corporate capitalism, and they want some regulations, but they tend to generally view there as being some room for free enterprise, especially as it relates to small businessmen, let's say. And generally speaking, it tends to be a kind of, if libertarianism is like the individual against the world, populism is like the people against the elite. And so for that reason, it may overlap with libertarianism insofar as the elite are the world. But it's much more collectivist, and it's more about the assertion of a kind of group interest. Now, in Europe, it was more difficult for this to arrive in Europe because in Europe, the elites were the aristocracy, the conservatives, the right wing. And so the people who rebelled against the right tended to be people like Marxists or like the French revolutionaries or people like that, who had a kind of elitism of their own, which isn't really amenable to populism. And so I think that populism in Europe is more of a kind of post-World War II thing that would see the kind of betrayal of traditional European societies to things like the European Union or the United Nations, that would seek to reestablish nation states, which is one of the reasons that European populism is so nation state oriented. So this is something that's always, I think, had a more of a presence in America, not least of which because America was kind of founded on this sort of rebellious spirit of resistance.
Mm-hmm. Now, one good illustration of your earlier point that populists are generally, but not exclusively, isolationist would be the fact that the Mexican-American War, which was supported by many Westerners, was quite popular with populists, the Jacksonian element of America. But say World War I, with the likes of William Jennings Bryan, was not so popular because World War I was perceived to be a banker's war, a war not in the interest of the American people. In fact, until the Zimmerman telegram was leaked, most Americans were still against war with Germany. Now, so would it be fair to say then, what you would say the common aspects of populism in the United States are that they oppose generally elite interests in favor of a group interest of the people, whatever that happens to be. Their economic interests are somewhere between socialism and libertarianism. While on the one hand, they agree with the socialists, unregulated markets need some regulations to be fair. They agree with the libertarians that markets are generally good. Just you can't let markets go too crazy. They're generally isolationist to the extent that the war can be associated with elite interests, but they're more willing to be interventionist if you can demonstrate that this war is in the popular interest. And so it's sort of in between socialism and libertarianism. Would that be a fair, concise definition of what you said?
That would be fair. And this calls to mind an exchange in publication between Tom Woods and the Southern historian of John C. Calhoun, Clyde Wilson, in which Wilson, being a kind of loyal Southerner, tried to make the case that the populism of Jennings Bryan was in direct continuity with the Jeffersonians and the Jacksonians. And Tom Woods took him to task on this because he was saying, well, no, look, here are all these regulations that Bryan supported, and all of the Western farming interests wanted antitrust laws and things of this nature, whereas the Jeffersonians were clearly opposed to this kind of thing, at least with respect to the federal government. And I think that Wilson's point was that populism supports regulations in response to violations of government authority. So in other words, where the state has stepped in and set things in disarray, then the state also has the duty to come in and rectify that with various kinds of counter-regulatory remedies. So for example, if the government is creating monopolies through special favors, then it also has the duty to come in and break them up. And you see this kind of argumentation with people who defend Trump, where they'll say, well, if we had real free trade, that would be one thing, but this isn't free trade. We have all of these sort of selective trade deals, and China inflating its currency with the liquidity trap and all of this kind of thing. So you need some kind of where we don't live in a libertarian world and never will. We have to learn to play by the rules of our competitors, and so there's always that kind of pragmatic element in the economics of populism.
Now, while Pat Buchanan, of course, is probably most well known as being a paleoconservative, I think, especially with Pat Buchanan, there is this crossover with paleoconservatives and populism. Because, for example, Donald Trump is commonly perceived of as a populist. And I remember reading an article on Pat Buchanan's website shortly after Donald Trump got elected, where he said that the key issues that I was arguing for, Donald Trump has won a campaign on. Now, obviously, Pat Buchanan doesn't mean the culture war, because Donald Trump didn't campaign on the culture war, but he did campaign on U.S. jobs going overseas due to, free markets, immigration as well. So what if any, overlap or connection do you see with paleoconservatism and populism?
Well, we've discussed this before, and it's kind of difficult to really make the concrete ties between paleoconservatism and populism. And it almost seems like the populists sort of intuitively pick up on things that the paleoconservatives articulate in a more intellectual way. But what I would say is that a good case study for this would be in the person of Sam Francis, who was really involved in the paleocon movement. But in his thesis on Middle American radicals, he basically outlined the kind of phenomenon that brought Trump to the White House, which is that in his thinking, people should abandon the culture war as it was conceived of in the 90s and should take up a more general stance against political correctness. They should drop libertarian rhetoric and replace it with a kind of economic populist position, and basically that there are these kind of apolitical, sort of silent majority of Americans who have this kind of psychology of Middle American radicals, and that a future populist resurrection or rise will have to speak to that. And I think that Trump really bore out that theory of Middle American radicals. Now, what is interesting is that this interplay between paleoconservatism and populism goes back to before we used these terms. And one might make the case that paleoconservatism is like cerebral populism. And this ties into what you were saying about the anti-war aspect of populism, that it seems like if you go back to the Jacksonian period, you have John Randolph of Roanoke, who was a sort of eccentric aristocratic Virginian, who was kind of the big paleocon of his day. And he was considered a leader of the South and of the extreme Jeffersonian position. Yet he ended up losing his office, as I believe his place in either the Senate or the Congress in Virginia, because he was opposed to the War of 1812. And the rest of the Virginian Republicans were all in favor of the War of 1812. But by contrast, he saw himself as his opposition to the War of 1812 as being part and parcel with his identity as an anti-government Southerner, an anti-federalist Southerner. And by also an example is John C. Calhoun, kind of the preeminent Southern Democrat, nevertheless opposed the Mexican-American War. Yet the surest support for the Mexican-American War came from the South, that Calhoun was supposed to be in support of. Now, Jennings Bryan's another example. He resigned his position from the cabinet of Woodrow Wilson because he was against entering World War I. Yet, of course, the people he represented, the kind of like lower class Southern Democrats, what have you, they were all very much in favor of going to war. And it was the Republicans who were the America First types. So it seems that wherever you have populism, it tends to be very pro-war in practice. But there's always this kind of like paleocon archetype that's always hiding behind it in America, where for some reason the leaders of militantly inclined populist iterations tend to be themselves anti-war, and that's very curious.
Well, in a lot of ways, Donald Trump is a continuation of that mold. A lot of the people that voted for Donald Trump were, America, nukes, F-16s, and Abrams tanks, AR-15s, and pickup trucks. And yet, Donald Trump is constantly getting lambasted by the liberal press for negotiating and de-escalating simmering conflicts with Russia and North Korea.
Absolutely, that's a case. Now, to an extent, obviously, it can kind of be reversed, and there are some more purist Trump supporters because today's wars are so obviously in service to the elite, to the globalists, that very often he will often play the other role, and it's his supporters that are more disappointed with the fact that he'll do things like engage with the strikes in Syria. But you're right, the kind of Republican base, if it weren't for Trump, would be more than happy to support wars if they were carried out by a Republican president.
Exactly. One of the things about populism is, as you've mentioned earlier, it doesn't really tend to have a sort of well thought out political philosophy like objectivism, libertarianism, socialism, Marxism, anarchism, fascism, and National Socialism. And I think part of this is because in the politics, Aristotle says that the middle class, which he identifies as the ideal class to have a class interest for the state, is that the poor and the rich have a lot of leisure time. The rich because they have so much money, and the poor because they have none and they're unemployed. And the middle class is busy just maintaining its position. It still has to work, otherwise it does risk falling down into poverty. But it's not so rich that it can just sort of kick back and relax and watch the world go by. And so for Aristotle, that was seen as a good thing because it prevented coups and revolutions and insurrections. But on the same token, though, since also Aristotle said the point of leisure was philosophy, and you need philosophers to have political ideologies, the working class don't have a lot of leisure. The middle class doesn't have a lot of leisure, so they're going to be short on the philosopher side. So I think using Aristotle as a tool of analysis, we can kind of see why populists tend not to have a sort of meta political position. Would you say that that's fair?
That is fair, and I think that the alt-right was in some ways an attempt to kind of give populism this sort of alternative, more intellectualized or at least systematized form. And so even though the alt-right tends to be very vulgar at times, it does have a more kind of abstract conception of how things should look, right? Like they really do fixate on a kind of anti-war preference or a preference against fiat money or what have you, in a way that the rank and file populists, it could be a swing and a miss. Now, insofar as the populists are not in power, they tend to be more alt-rightish, that is to say, more purist. So if you remember, when Donald Trump was campaigning, he seemed a lot more alt-right in terms of the kind of thing, the way that he was talking, whereas now he seems a lot more like a Republican. And so one wonders, with people like Nigel Farage, who, he'll appear on shows like Louder with Crowder. He met with Lauren Southern when she was in Great Britain, and seems to generally be connected with that whole spirit of things, at least tangentially. And of course, he was very skeptical about the strikes on Syria in Trump's first year in office. But one wonders if he would change and become less like that and more asystematical and non-ideological if he were to, say, take public office in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. Because this is one of the, I guess, depending on how you look at it, a strength or a weakness is because they're not, the populists aren't tied up in these very precise political theories. They can be a bit more pragmatic, and well, on the one hand, their goals are probably more realizable because they're not so purist. Not only are they more likely to achieve their goals, they're more likely to be able to, or sorry, not only they're more likely to have achievable goals, because they're pragmatic, they're more likely to be able to achieve those goals. Whereas more ideologically pure groups not only have goals that are very difficult to achieve, they don't have a very good probability of achieving them at all either.
Well, that's the strength, but it's also the great paradox, because the problem is that then you end up with John Bolton as your national security advisor. And I think that when people like Pat Buchanan and Russell Kirk talk about the negation of ideology, I don't really think that they know what the negation of ideology looked like, because these were very kind of intuitive, philosophical, intellectual people. And I think that when they talked about the negation of ideology, I don't think that they realized exactly how negated it would look in practice, because Trump, for all of his brilliance, politically speaking, is actually, and actually being ironically a great politician in a sense. really does not seem to demonstrate any kind of ability in systematic thinking. He's very smart at doing things, but I don't really get the sense that his lack of abstractive thinking is an act. I really do think that is a blind spot for him.
Well, you see, that's kind of the trade-off. That's why what you ideally would want is a sort of right-wing thinker who's thought things out, who's pragmatic enough to know that he can't get what he wants all the time, and then sort of be like an advisor behind the president in a way that Steve Bannon was until he got dismissed.
Yeah, Steve Bannon is a good example, and I'm glad that you brought him up because he really is kind of he's emblematic of that link, insofar as there is one, between the alt-right and populism, kind of the Breitbart link, you might call it. And Bannon is kind of like with Farage and Marine Le Pen. I think that these people, it's not just that they're out of power, right? I do believe that these people, what they may lack in, and certainly I don't mean to say these people are obviously very street smart as well, much more so than the average person, but not to the extent that Trump is. And so there's this kind of paradox, whereas these people, Le Pen, Farage, Bannon, are they're more able, I think, to tap into the intellectual, systematic side of things. They, you might say, have more imagination, might be a way of putting it. At the same time, I think that there's a reason that they are not occupying the same kind of places that Trump is, right? That they don't, it's not just that their circumstances are unfavorable, it's that Trump, when he ran, he really knew what he was doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, again, the trade-off with being a super IQ, big brain nibba type person. You tend to lack people skills. And that's not good if you want to run for political office. And just being streetwise in general, you live life in your head. So, somebody might just walk up and mug you and you don't even know what's going on. And that's what, so ideally you want both. Right now, we don't seem to have that, again, since Steve Bannon was removed. But where would you put Steve Bannon on this? Would he be populist, alt-right, crossover? What exactly is Steve Bannon?
I think he's a populist, and I think he's basically the intellectual of the populists, or the closest thing that they have to it. That's how he styles himself. He certainly has more institutional connection to the populists. He doesn't really speak the language of the paleo-conservatives. I don't really imagine a textbook paleocon being such an avid supporter for Israel, for example. Also, his enthusiastic admiration for Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln is very un-paleo-conservative. Now, with the exception of Pat Buchanan, but as we mentioned, Buchanan kind of has his foot in both camps. But this kind of you might say, his idea of continuing the legacy of the 19th century American North, the Clay Lincoln kind of pro-tariff, pro-central government model of society, and then his institutional connection to people like Trump in the business world. This is all quintessentially populist. Whereas I've never really heard Bannon reference someone like Tom Fleming or something like that. He just doesn't seem to live in that world.
Now, one of the things that is at least populism, as it's manifested as a political expression, I would argue tends to be reactionary, in the sense that it's reacting to some sort of perceived grievance, because, as we've already stated, it doesn't really have a sort of life of its own with an independent intellectual stream. So again, this may be somewhat anachronistic, but the earliest example I can think of populism is the Cracky brothers. And what motivated them was the fact that after Rome's wars of expansion, the independent yeoman farmer class had been decimated, as their properties had been sold off to the patricians and then staffed by slaves. And so they sort of capitalized on how the elite had screwed the working class, for lack of a better word. And and tried to capitalize on that. And we sort of see also a very similar attitude with William Jennings Bryan, with his free silver and cross of gold speech. The financial system is out to get the working man. And one of the things is that does seem to be a weakness, because since it's purely reactive or almost entirely reactive, then once the threat, either it's defeated or it wins. And if it wins and that particular issue is dealt with, it then goes away. And that may not deal with the fundamental issue. So for example, one could argue that the campaigning and electioneering of William Jennings Bryan helped move the Overton window on government labor regulations to be more sensitive to the issues of the working class. But from the point of view of many people, not just socialists, at best, that was just a Band-Aid. That wasn't really dealing with the fundamental issue at stake. And so that is one of, I think, the weaknesses of populism, is that because it's symptomatic, it's reacting to symptoms rather than to root causes generally. It doesn't necessarily fix the problem, even if it wins that particular battle against that particular symptom.
Well, now, hidden in this, though, is a possible benefit of populism, in that there is a strength to not treating the cause and treating the symptoms, because very often it's the revolutions that try to address the causes that end up being the most totalitarian and ideological. So, for example, Marxism is very careful about not treating the symptoms and treating what it views as the problem. And it's not just Marxism, but there are any number of reactions that attempt to do this. And so there is, I suppose, a kind of humility inherent in trying to fix symptoms instead of problems, because there's a recognition that not all, that to a certain extent, the human condition can't be evaded. So I do think that there's some good there. But on the other hand, what this does mean is it means that populism will tend to only be able to operate in proportion to how bad things are, which makes it unreliable.
Exactly. Maybe a better way to phrase this as, because it's only dealing with symptomatic problems and then it dissolves away once it's succeeded. If we have a systemic issue, like, say, for example, from our perspective, a left-leaning bent in society due to government and media, it's not going to really be able to handle that problem, because, well, we won this fight, we can go home now. Well, yeah, you won that battle, but the war's still ongoing, and you're just going to go home now because you won the battle. Again, it's a very American thing to do, right? The militia get called up, they fight the battle, they go home. Of course, that's not suitable for winning the war. And there's pros and cons, right? Because, of course, a professional army could win the war, but you run the risk of losing political freedom at home. Now, as to your point about treating symptoms or causes, that, yeah, there is the risk that you will lead to a worse system. But I think there's really two kinds of revolutions that we need to think of. And they both deal with root causes. And it's correctly and incorrectly identifying the root cause. So you could argue the French, Russian revolutions, the Latin American revolutions incorrectly identified the root cause of whatever problems they were dealing with. And so because they misidentified it, it led to a massively worse system. But if you look at, say, the revolution against the Pisistrati in Athens, the revolution against the Tarquins in Rome, and then the revolution against the British in 1776, you could argue that the root cause was the tyrannical actions of a ruler, whether it was, the Pisistrati, Tarquin Superbus, or King George III, or rather, more accurately, members of Parliament, because King George III was not nearly as influential, powerful at that time as a continental monarch would have been. And in which case, they're just trying to remove a particular bad actor or become free from a particular bad actor, whereas the communists want to abolish an entire system. Whereas, so you're not getting rid of Tarquin Superbus, you're getting rid of the entire capitalist system. and it's not something that they seem to be very practical at doing. So, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that insofar as populism needs that kind of focus and sense of longevity, and also insofar as it needs to appeal to the other groups that we discuss, I think that where it's helpful to look to is the real gem that exists in populism. And that is in its attempt to confront head on the managerial state. So I agree with Steve Bannon and Paul Gottfried that basically the best characterization of the current plight of society is in the cultural Marxist agenda of the managerial state that's meant to re-educate people, that's meant to reform society in a particular image, and is basically the deeper root of political correctness. Now, more so than any other ideology that we're discussing, populism, insofar as it does have a system, would seem to be, and Steve Bannon really hints at this, especially in the early days of his participation in the Trump administration, that the deconstruction of the administrative state, managerial state, is precisely the goal of populism. And so I think that a way of refocusing populism and giving it some kind of ability to transcend its is by really focusing on this aspect of a grander but still pragmatic and still ecumenical vision, which is we have this problem of the managerial state, and we're not content to just sit back and talk about John C. Calhoun or Nietzsche or whatever. We really want to get to work and deconstruct this thing that's inexorably making everyone's lives work. And I think that would be a good suggestion as to where populism should focus its attention going forward.
Mm-hmm. It seems that populism is more of a strategy than a philosophy, and it works better as a part of networked whole with other intellectual groups that maybe lack people skills and grassroots skills, and in a more sort of web of interlocking components, maybe. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree, and you always see that populism tends to do this, right? That it tends to be either to inject itself or to be injected by adjuncts in other with other philosophies. So, for example, in the 30s, to an extent, there were elements of populism that were kind of infused in fascism. In the Jacksonians and with the Bryanites, basically populism was kind of injected with this flavor of Jeffersonianism, of the kind of identity of the Southern and Western factions. And of course, when Trump was campaigning, it was in concert with the kind of alt-light meme war and that whole cultural phenomenon on the internet. And so I think that populism, it's almost like tofu, right? You have to cook it with something else in order to give it any flavor.
I like that. But that's not necessarily a bug. That could be a feature.
Yeah, I agree. That absolutely could be a feature, and also probably would serve to temper the severity of the adjunct ideologies, which without the kind of something to bring them down to earth could potentially be a lot crazier.
True. So the what are some of your thoughts on? Let me ask you this: what do you think were the key factors that led to the rise of populism in the past 5 years and the election of Donald Trump?
Well, that's a difficult question, and it's kind of a matter of the chicken and the egg, right? Because everybody started to see the left started to get extremely crazy right around the time that populism started to grow. And it can be very difficult to document which of those actually took place first. I think that, truth be told, it was the left that started it in this case. And I mean, I know that in general, the left, of course, is the sort of the thing that's being dealt with. But I mean, in the particulars, I think that the populist rise was kind of something that was catalyzed, as it were, by the more intense behavior on the part of the left. Because you have to remember that, say, 2014, 2015, that's exactly when Black Lives Matter started to become bigger, when the kind of various like safe spaces on college campuses. That's when you started hearing about things like trigger warnings and this general intensification of political correctness. And this might be subjective or impressionistic on my part, but I remember a very firm change in the culture, right? Things were always left, and there was always this feeling of a left-wing bias. But I remember being on, say, college campuses or in school, and yes, everyone was a liberal, but they were still the kind of liberals that you could call bleeding heart liberals, right? And they would just treat right-wing people like, well, he's kind of a crazy conservative or something. And they basically were content with a kind of intellectual superiority, like much more kind of like the Richard Dawkins skeptic variety, like this sort of more gratuitous kind of 2000, like early 2000s sort of vibe. And I remember it just shifted. And it's like one day, suddenly, they were no longer really content with that. And they started doing weird things like attacking themselves and just going into a frenzy. And to be honest, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the very young, the tail end of the millennial generation came of age at that time. So I think it might have been a generation of people who were trained for this new wave of intensity, and that's probably why it was so focused in the university systems.
Just to interject real quick, I would argue it begins even earlier than that. 2011 with Elevator Gate, when the new atheist community had its big schism.
Yeah, sure. And that's something that you do hear in the early days. The skeptic community talk a lot about. I've been going through a lot of Sargon of Akkad's archives to get a feel for what things were like in the early days. And that certainly seems to be the split between the basically the split between the anti-cultural Marxist reaction on the internet and the people who were instigating it, which once again really reinforces the thesis that the left were the catalyst for this. Now, Trump, after this intensifies, right, after it's kind of fully intensified by 2015, this is when Trump starts running. And so that seems to me to be the progression of events. Like you say, you have Elevator Gate, you have this sort of division in the left, with the skeptic community, and then you have the whole Zimmerman affair, and you have BLM, and you've got like things like the new speech codes on college campuses, and then Brexit and Trump don't happen until after that's already intensified.
Exactly. The left. Now, this, I tend to agree with you. It looks like they were building up a cadre for a big push. They, A, hadn't had a cadre trained yet, and B, there really wasn't there wasn't really the opportune time yet to let loose the dogs of war, to quote Mark Anthony. But now it looks, but around 2011, 2012, see, I think what was key there was the impression that the religious right had lost the culture war. So George W. Bush, rightly or wrongly, was seen as the last hurrah of the religious right and the general right-wing resistance in the culture war. And when he got defeated by Obama, they're like, we won. It's over, man. We won. And so now they overplayed their hand. They're finally like, okay, we won with Obama. We've got the far left agenda in place. Now, all these people that were just useful idiots and hangers-on for our movement, time for the purges. Oh, it looks like they started the purges a little too early.
Yeah, and this is a great segue into another factor that we haven't discussed yet, which is the Obama administration. The Obama administration was a very tricky thing, and the Republicans, I think, are largely responsible for what it got away with, and not in the way that you'd think. What I think happened is that Obama, for all of his talk about hope and change and this kind of cool factor that made him sort of off-putting in his campaign, when he got in office, he often came across as very reasonable, very cool-headed, and on the surface of it, really did seem like a kind of white collar bureaucrat who was almost boring at times. And I think that in a sense, this really gave the illusion that he was a kind of moderate, because there was this kind of relaxation in the tone of the political culture for most of Obama's time in office. That is, there was a relaxation that you didn't have in the time of George W. Bush, right? People were, in the, say, the first term of Obama, there was less screaming. There was less of this kind of feeling that everyone needed to walk on eggshells, and this kind of feeling of smug contentment on the part of the left with Obama. Now, this is also something that the Republicans are at fault for, and the reason they're at fault for it is because the main reaction to Obama with the Republicans was the Tea Party. And the Tea Party wanted to portray him as a socialist, which is just a horribly irresponsible reaction or misrepresentation of everything that was wrong with Obama, right? He wasn't a socialist. Obamacare was something that any Republican would do, right? Now, I'm not saying that Obamacare was in any way good or constitutional, but I'm saying it was a distraction. Obamacare and his attack on the financial institutions was a distraction, and the Tea Party had a hand in playing this up because their narrative is Obama is a socialist. And of course, Obama wasn't a socialist, and that just made them look ridiculous, and it made Obama look calm and sensible by comparison. Meanwhile, this all serves as a cover for the fact that he is, as Paul Gottfried has pointed out, the most radical, culturally radical president in the history of the United States, who's passed in the Title IX provisions, the Dear Colleague letter, who was responsible in all of these kind of behind the scenes stunts with, interjecting into affairs between black perpetrators or alleged perpetrators in the police, and basically through the power of the administrative branch, very quietly importing all of these changes that would serve to support the kind of cultural shift that would take place by the end of his time in office.
Yeah, that's the danger when you allow your shock troops to get a little too ahead of the game. It makes your opponent look reasonable. Now, what was interesting, this is not entirely related to populism, but what made the alt-right useful and kind of avoided the Tea Party trap was that nobody really supported the alt-right. They were just kind of allowed to be the radical, scary people. And there was really no fallout for Trump because Trump wasn't supporting them. Trump wasn't behind them. So it's really all the benefits of having a base that says outlandish things, well, having to be responsible for it.
Sure. I mean, maybe you could reiterate that question, because I think I might not have gotten the thrust behind it.
Yeah. So when you have a group that's extremely radical, and then you kind of dial it back 2 or 3 degrees, you look more reasonable, but you're still pushing the window rightward. So in the sense that you said the Tea Party overreacted by calling Obama a socialist, and they had a lot of support from mainstream Republicans, it kind of hurt the overall Republican position in that 4-year period, 8-year period, whereas the alt-right wasn't really officially endorsed by anybody, and least of all Trump. And so on the one hand, they create this scary alternative of, ooh, the ethno-nationalist neo-Nazis. So when Trump is advocating a right-wing populist position, it looks sane because it's not nearly as crazy as some of the alt-right memes.
Okay, I think I understand now. So yes, I mean I suppose the fact that Republicans have been maneuvered into being less volatile than the sort of the early Fox News days and the Tea Party has kind of served the right, because the left have kind of taken up the place of the screaming demagogue, and that by contrast makes Trump sane look much more sane than he might otherwise. But there's something that I really want to make clear here, is that something that you said, that the right overreacted to Obama by calling him a socialist. In some ways, yes, but in other ways they underreacted. I think that what really happened is not that they overreacted, it's that they didn't react to the right thing. They were reacting to the things that were not true about Obama, like him being a socialist. Meanwhile, he was engaged in completely revolutionizing the entire culture into something that looks like what it does today. And because they were so focused on this kind of Cold War hangover language of communist sympathizer and Marxist and all of this, they completely overlooked the reformation of the Obama era in the cultural arena.
Yeah. Now, but would you in general agree, though, that this latest attack on the right by the left, this purge, even within the left itself, is the result that they thought they won? They thought with Obama they'd won. This is all baked into the cake. Now it's time to purge people.
That I think probably is a part of it. I think that obviously if they had if there had not been some element of them overplaying their hand, then they would not be getting the current reaction. So obviously they would not have behaved in a way that would lead to this reaction. And so I think that you are probably right that they had become complacent in their position and thought that they would be able to chew what they then proceeded to bite off.
Yeah. Now, what would you say? I mean, again, these kinds of predictions are always suspect and dangerous, but if you have to predict for 2020, do you think Donald Trump will win the 2020 election?
Well, of course, this depends in large part on the economy. Because in a sense, I understand Trump's temptation in taking credit for the rise in the stock market. On the day of his election, it rose to an all-time high. So if I had just been elected president and then the stock market hits an all-time high, I admit I'd be pretty tempted to claim that as a victory for myself. But at the same time, I mean, Trump almost sounded like an Austrian in the last few days before he came to the White House. And he was talking about how we're in the middle of a financial bubble and how we need to raise interest rates and how all of this is an artificial inflation that is going to collapse. But then once he took power, he took credit for it. And I think that in the long run, that was probably a monumentously bad move, because then he will have to also own up, that his enemies will force him to own up they will credit him with whatever disaster follows from that. So I obviously don't know to what extent any crash will happen before the 2020 election. I think that if there is not a crash, Trump is going to I think he will be reelected. But what is funny is that I'm not as certain as I was that he would be elected in the first place. And I remember that just before 2016, I was very insistent that Trump absolutely will be elected president. And people were saying that that's just the country's not ready, you're crazy, whatever. But I think it's because Trump had something then that certainly does not seem to be there anymore, that energy that was there. That kind of appeal, because people, you might say that the mask has been torn away to an extent. I think that the Democrats are doing him a favor because, I mean, I can't imagine like a more bizarre congregation of weirdos than the people who fill up the Democratic debate stage. But on the other hand, I don't know how happy I can be about that, because while, you know, I support Trump and I will be supportive of him in 2020, nevertheless, it does seem like these Democrats are so bad that they may be handing Trump another easy 4 years without any sense that he has to raise his game. So they might be condemning us to another 4 years of gameless Trump.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility too. What would you say at the moment are the weaknesses of populism right now?
Well, the weaknesses of populism are probably not its fault, in that they are the complete ownership of the governments in Western nations by the managerial state. So it's not entirely Trump's fault that he steps into the White House and finds it difficult to do things, because anyone would have difficulty doing things who was not genuinely on the side of the normal government page. I think that it is something that is very difficult to deal with and will take a lot of time to address. I also think that the thing that we talked about before, where populism tends to work, it tends to be made to work by people who are not necessarily imaginative people. And so for that reason will lack certain intellectual consistency and may not really see where they are doing things that run counter to the things that they've supported in the past, like being opposed to neoconservatism and then having John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and all of these people around. So you might say it's not intuitive enough, but too instinctive in a sense.
Okay.
I also think that there is a weirder problem, which is its fixation with Israel, which is very suspicious because the paleocons have the opposite of this problem, had the opposite of this problem. And it is very strange that the elites, that they seem to be competing with the elites for their favoritism towards Israel, which is very not compatible with the desire to disentangle oneself from the various wars and international intrusions in foreign countries.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would be the course that the populace should take to achieve further success in the future?
Well, like I said, to give themselves their luster back, to be able to fixate on something that can not only give them momentum and connect with the people at large, but also with potential adjunct ideologies, would be to frame things in terms of opposition to the managerial state. That is something that I think both the populace and the elites can get, and the like alternative ideologues can get behind. I think that's something that basically unites the Parthenon, and the populists have to be on the front lines to deal with this. And the only way to maintain their perspective, to maintain their frame, is to it's like if when an artist makes a painting, I would imagine that he would have to find a certain focal point and then paint around that point as a kind of a part of the what provides a frame of reference. Well, the point that the populism has to fixate on in order to maintain its larger frame is a singular opposition to the managerial state. And so that is really the main type of advice that I would give to populists.
What do you think would be the likely adjunct political ideologies that would be allies of the populist movement in the future?
Well, certainly the alt-right is the most obvious one, because they are not only have been, but they are indeed an adjunct ideology to the populists. So that's a good thing. Libertarians are generally unreliable. They will, like Lou Rockwell sounded pretty supportive of Trump, and you had Ralph Raico, and I believe it was Walter Block led the Libertarians for Trump. But they will not be terribly reliable because they're the most ideologically fixated. The paleoconservatives really lack any significance, unfortunately. So while they can be relied on to an extent, it's not necessarily the best place to focus one's energies. With respect to the ethno-nationalists, I think that the ethno-nationalists and the neo-reactionaries and the manosphere generally will be supportive of populism in proportion, in a way that's commensurate with its ability to be non-neoconservative, which is another reason I think that populism, if it cooperates with the alt-right and it focuses on its opposition to the managerial state, I think that you will have grumbling ethno-nationalists, neo-reactionaries, and manospherians who will sort of reluctantly continue to support it, because they themselves are very desperate people. And I have a good example of this, that apparently Mencius Moldbug, or Curtis Yarvin, had said on Trump's inaugurational day that even though Trump doesn't admit it, Trump is actually fully enlightened, meaning he thought that Trump was a full adherent of the Dark Enlightenment secretly. So if the alt-right proper is that hungry for validation, then I think that they will probably be reliable, provided that you don't sound too much like a neocon.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Is there any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I think that what I've said probably constitutes sufficient final words. I'd like to thank you, Todd, for having this discussion, and direct people to my channel, Right Ruminations, where I discuss things like this all the time, which I believe is usually linked below. So thanks again, and I look forward to next week.
All right. Thank you. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.